always remember to ask activists if they're really communists. Hey, it's Prince of Queens, and I figured I might as well just improv this video because I have a few things to do later. And honestly, while there's a part of me that wants to actually, write this out and make it concise and well detailed and carefully worded, I might as well just rant about this because it's not actually that complicated. I feel like I can get my message across fairly simply. That is, activists, people who self-identify as activists, who go around claiming that they're anti-racist and anti-discrimination, anti-LGBT discrimination, pro-transgender rights, blah, 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 blah. These people are so often communists. So often communists. Or at least they are a part of an organization that is headed by communists, and they don't really even know it because they didn't ask enough questions. And it's really, really a shame. Because personally, I've always been somebody who considers myself against racism, legitimate racism. I'm being gay. I've always been against homophobia and against transphobia and transgender and gay people being treated legitimately unfairly. I'm obviously very much against that. So I've been drawn to various people who claim to be doing activism or artistic activism at various points in my life. So when there's congregations of them, when they're grouping together and they're going to try to fight for something, like they have some cause that they're saying, oh, this city's doing this thing and we think that it's racist. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes there's something that's happening that is going to have tangible negative effects on communities of racial minorities. And you would actually want to potentially join their fight against this. However, often, you find yourself getting in bed with communists. You find yourself working with people who are full-blown communists. Now, I'm not saying you should never, ever be on a political action committee if something's really important and you really feel strongly about it. I don't think that you should just completely avoid associating with somebody because they identify as a communist 100% across the board. I probably personally wouldn't, because I've known too many of these people, and it turns out that they're all like really, really messed up in the head, and they lie a lot, and they have no sort of personal loyalty to anybody that they might ever work with. It's always about the Communist Party and installing this utopianist vision of society that they kind of want. And if they realize that you're going to eventually get in the way of that because you're not a communist, they will throw you under the bus. They will betray you. They will backstab you. They will, if you became their friend, let's say you befriended one of these people on some sort of political action committee, and you hung out with them a few times, and you talked about how you used to have a drinking problem and how you had a bad relationship that ended because you and your ex would get into some fights, and one time it got physical, but nobody called the cops or anything, and, let's say that's not me. That never happened with me. I've never had a physical fight with an ex. But let's say that happened. Let's say you used to have a drinking problem and you did get in a physical fight with one of your exes one time, and you happen to tell this person who is a communist that. The second this person realizes that you're not a communist and there's some sort of public, let's say you're in a Facebook forum and you start arguing about politics, and this person's, really, really advocating for communism, and you're like, hey, I don't agree with this stuff, and I actually, it doesn't make sense. It's violent. I don't agree with attacking people at free speech rallies. This person will take their gloves off and deliver every single low blow that they possibly can. They will say, well, yeah, well, you certainly agree with being an alcoholic and getting in a fight and beating up your girlfriend and shit like that. Like, they will have no problem just throwing your name through the mud and having zero, zero integrity for the trust that you gave them as a friend, because they don't have friends. Like, they're more than willing to sacrifice friendship for their political beliefs. And they'll always be like this, because communism demands from people that they sacrifice any sort of, not just their own personal liberties, but their own loyalty to their individual friendships in favor of the collective, this utopian collective that doesn't exist, that they wish existed. So if you find yourself in a crowd of activists, and I can't say it's always bad to be around activists. I've known plenty of activists, and sometimes they're doing good stuff for good reasons, unions and crap like that. And you notice some of them are talking in a certain way. The communists dog whistle to each other, because it's not they're not supposed to really say that they're communists. But if they start saying things like, they start talking about transformative justice, that's a big one. Communists love to talk about transformative justice. I'm sure there's people who aren't communists who mention that, but it's a big one. That's a big kind of a dog whistle. Another thing that they love to say is that they'll say, we're not just fighting against racism, but we're fighting against the systems that put racism in place. These are people who are probably communists. If they demonize capitalism a lot, they're probably communists. And there's various other things that can kind of tip you off. So just the point of this video is, when you suspect that might be the case, just ask them if they're communists. Seriously, just ask them. And don't do it at the beginning of a conversation in the way that, for me, when I start advocating for the gender-specific issues of men and boys, and I'm talking to a feminist online, they say, are you MRA? And it's off-putting, and it's almost like an accusation of some sort of negative attribute that I don't think it's negative. I don't think it's negative to advocate for men's rights. And communists, similarly, don't think it's negative to advocate for communism, but they know that other people think so. So they will potentially try to worm their way around saying so. So you should try to be a little bit careful about how you word your question. Try to be a little bit sly. Don't just come right out and say, are you a communist? But ask. Find a way to ask. Find a way to, maybe ask, what do you think of Yvette Falarca and her struggle down in Berkeley? What do you think of Antifa? What do you think of, things like that? And be like, well, what do you think the end goal of this anarchist movement would potentially be? And would you want that? Ask these things. Seriously. Really remember to ask. Because I don't think a lot of people realize how many of these people are actually communists. And it's a bad thing. There's no redeeming a communist in the current year. I could see potentially, back when communist revolutions hadn't really happened and killed dozens and dozens and dozens of millions of people over and over in China, the Soviet Union, and now Venezuela, or whatever. I can see why the idealistic, well-intentioned communist person was a much different person than they are in the current year. But current year communists, full-blown communists in the current year, that is a hopefully temporary, and I think usually temporary, but it's a psychological sickness. I don't think it's a pathological sickness, but I do think that it's a psychologically induced, socially induced psychological sickness, where people have been conditioned to believe that the only way to achieve fairness is through this communist system in which everybody is forced to share all of their resources with each other, and everybody's forced to work to their full potential. Not necessarily forced, but everybody's working to their full potential voluntarily in order to share all of their resources with each other evenly, and people will do this voluntarily, right? That's what these people think. They think that that's possible. But of course, we know that that's not possible. It's never been possible. Anytime one person could work a little bit harder to get a little bit extra stuff, they're going to do it. And we've seen that every time they've tried to have communism. There's always the people who end up being a little bit more privileged. So those people end up getting demonized because they aren't cooperative enough, and the other people get mad, and it's gotten to the point where current day communists just think that anybody who isn't a communist, who doesn't agree with this stuff, because maybe they've studied history a little bit, they just believe that anybody like myself is protecting my own privilege because I am not a communist, and therefore I'm evil, and therefore I am their enemy because I'm in the way of utopia. And that mentality, like demonizing me preemptively because I'm allegedly getting in the way of utopia, like that's a psychological sickness. Like they're sick in the head if they've been conditioned to believe that, and they need to be deprogrammed. Like it's not rational, and it would require a lot of very deliberate programming from a lot of very dishonest sources, and a lot of sources that tell you that you're not allowed to ask questions. It's like, oh, so we're going to start telling you, oh yeah, these are all the answers: transformative justice, anti-racism, dismantling the system that built racism. How do we do that? Well, we're going to tell you, and we're going to do it together. Okay, well, I want to ask some questions. No. Your job is to shut up and listen, white boy. And the worst communists are, in the current year, are generally privileged, relatively privileged white people who are susceptible to this like guilting, and susceptible to this notion of never being allowed to talk because of their privilege, and that guilt inspires them to sign up and not ask questions. But at some point they do start to learn that they're communists, and you should just really ask them if they are. Because they might not tell you directly, but they'll not tell you that they're not communists. They won't tell you, oh no, absolutely not, communism is horrible. They'll probably tell you something like, oh, no, I mean, I'm not like trying to install the Soviet Union. That had many, many flaws, but that wasn't real communism. That is what they'll probably tell you. And you should know that. You should don't be under any illusions that it's going to go down any different than that. But you don't have to take my word for it. Ask them. Next time you're around a bunch of activists, ask them. Okay.